Imelda Romualdez Marcos, born Imelda Remedios Visitación, Trinidad, Romualdez, July 2nd, 1929, is a Filipino politician who was First Lady of the Philippines from 1965 to 1986, wielding significant political power after her husband Ferdinand Marcos placed the country under martial law in September 1972. She is the mother of current President Bongbong Marcos. During her husband's 21-year rule, Imelda Marcos ordered the construction of many grandiose architectural projects using public funds and, in impossibly short order, a propaganda practice, which eventually came to be known as her Edifice complex. She and her husband stole billions of pesos from the Filipino people, amassing a personal fortune estimated to have been worth $5 billion to $10 billion by the time they were deposed in 1986. By 2018, about $3.6 billion of this had been recovered by the Philippine government, either through compromise deals or sequestration cases. Marcos and her family gained notoriety for living a lavish lifestyle during a period of economic crisis and civil unrest in the country. She spent much of her time abroad on state visits, extravagant parties, and shopping sprees, and spent much of the state's money on her personal art, jewelry, and shoe collections, amassing 3,000 pairs of shoes, the subject of dozens of court cases around the world. She was eventually convicted of corruption charges in 2018 for her activities during her term as governor of Metro Manila. Her family's 1986 ouster and subsequent exile in Hawaii led to a number of disputes and legal proceedings, including accusations of plundering the Filipino government's wealth. Imelda Marcos returned to the Philippines in the 1990s, where she ran for president and served as a congresswoman. She is still involved in various legal cases related to corruption. Early life Imelda Remedios Visitación Romualdez was born at dawn in San Miguel, Manila on July 2nd, 1929. Her parents were Vicente Orestes Romualdez, 1885 to 1955, a lawyer, and his second wife, Maria Remedios Trinidad, 1902 to 1938. Imelda is the sixth of Vicente's 11 children and Remedios' firstborn. She was born into the Romualdez political dynasty from the province of Leyte and grew up in a wealthy clan of devout Catholics. Notable members of Imelda's family include the clan matriarch Dona Trinidad Lopez de Romualdez, her uncle Norberto Romualdez, who was a Supreme Court Associate Justice, and her younger brother Benjamin Coqui Romualdez, who served as governor of Leyte and later as an ambassador under the regime of Imelda's husband, Ferdinand Marcos. In her early life, financial conditions of Imelda's family began to decline, and by 1938 she and her family lived in relative poverty. She eventually became active in her community and began her career early, first as a model and later in various media and fashion-related industries. Education and career Imelda Marcos finished her studies at the University of the Philippines, where she was an active leader in campus politics. Early in her political career, she became noticed for her beauty and flair, factors that played a significant role in the political rise of her husband, Ferdinand Marcos. She became involved in national politics, often appearing by her husband's side in public appearances, and was appointed to various influential posts, such as chair of significant cultural landmarks. During her term as First Lady, she was known for her extravagant spending on personal collections and various construction projects. Her lavishness and the numerous corruption cases brought her into the international spotlight, but she continued to serve in various political capacities until the Marcos family was exiled to Hawaii in 1986. Downfall and return after the 1986 revolution, the Marcos family found themselves living in exile in Hawaii, where Ferdinand Marcos later died. Imelda Marcos worked on her image and pursued successful endeavors, including running for presidential office in the early 1990s. However, she later focused on representing her political constituency in Congress, where she occasionally ran into legal and financial troubles. She has appeared in various court cases concerning her assets and wealth accumulated through alleged corrupt practices during her time in power. Despite legal challenges, she has maintained a presence in Filipino politics. Major court cases and personal wealth of Imelda Marcos and her husband Ferdinand faced multiple corruption charges, both in the Philippines and internationally. Large sums of wealth have been discovered in Swiss bank accounts, jewelry, and art collections, much of which has been returned to the Filipino government through legal channels. She once claimed that the family's wealth came from a stashed treasure of Japanese loot from World War II. However, despite these claims, her net worth was substantially lower than the initial estimates published. The term immodific was coined to describe actions and behaviors characterized by extravagant excesses, often referring to her vast collection of shoes and expensive lifestyle. Tron 2 minutes and 42 seconds, Imelda Romualdez Marcos, locally, born Imelda Remedios Visitación, Trinidad Romualdez, July 2, 1929, is a Filipino politician who was First Lady of the Philippines from 1965 to 1986, wielding significant political power after her husband Ferdinand Marcos placed the country under martial law in September 1972. She is the mother of current President Bongbong Marcos. During her husband's 21-year rule, Imelda Marcos ordered the construction of many grandiose architectural projects using public funds and in impossibly short order. A propaganda practice which eventually came to be known as her Edifice complex. She and her husband stole billions of pesos from the Filipino people, amassing a personal fortune estimated to have been worth $5 billion to $10 billion by the time they were deposed in 1986. By 2018, about $3.6 billion of this had been recovered by the Philippine government, either through compromise deals or sequestration cases. Marcos and her family gained notoriety for living a lavish lifestyle during a period of economic crisis and civil unrest in the country. She spent much of her time abroad on state visits, extravagant parties, and shopping sprees, and spent much of the state's money on her personal art, jewelry, and shoe collections, amassing 3,000 pairs of shoes. The subject of dozens of court cases around the world. She was eventually convicted of corruption charges in 2018 for her activities during her term as governor of Metro Manila. The case is under appeal. She and her husband hold the Guinness World Record for the greatest robbery of a government, putting Suharto of neighboring Indonesia in second place. The People Power Revolution in February 1986 unseated the Marcoses and forced the family into exile in Hawaii. In 1991, President Corazon Aquino allowed the Marcos family to return to the Philippines to face various charges after Ferdinand's death in 1989. Imelda Marcos was elected 4 times to the House of Representatives of the Philippines and ran twice for the presidency of the Philippines but failed to garner enough votes. Early life, Imelda Remedios Visitación Romualdez was born at dawn in San Miguel, Manila on July 2, 1929. Her parents were Vicente Orestes Romualdez, 1885 to 1955, a lawyer, and his second wife, Maria Remedios Trinidad, 1902 to 1938. Imelda is the sixth of Vicente's 11 children and Remedios' firstborn. Her paternal great-grandfather is Fray Francisco Miguel Lopez Delgado, a Spanish friar and silversmith from Granada, and Aluja, who became the parish priest of Pandacan in Manila. Born into the Romualdez political dynasty from the province of Leyte, Imelda grew up in a wealthy clan of devout Catholics. She was baptized in the nearby San Miguel Church on the day after her birth. Notable members of Imelda's family include the clan matriarch Dona Trinidad Lopez de Romualdez, her uncle Norberto Romualdez, who was Supreme Court Associate Justice, and her younger brother Benjamin Coqui Romualdez, who served as governor of Leyte and later as an ambassador under the regime of Imelda's husband, Ferdinand Marcos. At the time of her birth, the Romualdezes were wealthy. Around 1932, the financial conditions of Imelda's family began to decline. Imelda's parents were separated for a time, during which Remedios worked for the nuns at the Asilo de San Vicente de Paul. Vicente and Remedios eventually reconciled, but to avoid further conflict, she and her children, including Imelda, moved to their house's garage. In 1937, after Conchita's birth, Remedios' health began to fail, and she died on April 7, 1938, due to double pneumonia. In her 10 years of marriage, Remedios had 6 children: Imelda, Benjamin, Alida, Alfredo, Armando, and Conchita. Remedios was born and raised in Baliwag, Bulacan. In November 1938, Imelda's father gave up Manila due to his declining fortunes in his law practice and returned to Tacloban, where he could support his family with a simpler lifestyle. She grew up learning the Wari language and then learned Tagalog and eventually English Education Elementary. Imelda finished grade 1 in the nearby College of the Holy Spirit, Manila, where her older half-sisters also studied. She continued her early studies at Holy Infant Academy, a convent school run by the Order of St. Benedict. The old wooden structure of the school still stands today 4 blocks away from the Romualdez house. At school, Imelda had to face her family's humiliating poverty, and she was frequently among the students who had to apologize for late payments. High school in 1942, the Romualdezes returned to Tacloban, and around that time, Imelda's father refused to let her go back to school. When the Americans returned in 1944, she was eager to resume her studies at Leyte Progressa High School. She finished her first year at the provincial high school, where she was also chosen Miss IA. Then in her second year, she moved to Holy Infant and stayed there until she graduated. Imelda continued her higher studies at Holy Infant Academy from 1938 to 1948, the year she graduated from high school. As a student, her scholastic record shows that she had a general average of 80% throughout her primary and high school. College. Imelda ran for president of the Student Council at St. Paul's College, now named Divine Word University, in 1951, 3 years before her marriage to Marcos. At that time, she was about to graduate with a degree in education. She was put up as a candidate for the Department of Education, which had an enrollment of 800 students. Even during the nomination, her victory was already a foregone conclusion, but the school authorities insisted that another candidate be put up to make the elections a democratic procedure. That was how the College of Law, with 200 students, put up Francisco Pedrosa. While an undergraduate student, Marcos taught at a local Chinese high school before graduating in 1952. She had won a scholarship to study music at the Philippine Women's University under Adoracion Reyes. A close friend of the family, she briefly held a job at a music store, but left for a better one at the central bank. After a few lessons, Adoracion was convinced that Imelda had talent and persuaded her to enroll at the College of Music and Fine Arts at Philippine Women's University, PWU, under a special arrangement that put her on register while Adoracion continued to give her free lessons. Early career. Imelda returned to Manila in 1952 under the rule of President Elpidio Quirino and stayed in the house of her relative, Speaker pro tempore Daniel Romualdez, who had 3 adopted children. Imelda's status in the Romualdez household during this time has been described as higher than servants and lower than family members, as a poor relative. Imelda found work as a salesgirl in a store called P. Domingo, which infuriated her father when he learned of it during one of his visits, perceiving it as ill treatment of Imelda. To calm the indignation of Vicente Romualdez, Eduardo and Daniel exercised their political and economic influence to find work for Imelda in the central bank, where she worked under Braulio Hipuna, the chief clerk of the intelligence division. During this time, her cousin Loreto Ramos introduced her to Adoracion Reyes, a teacher from the College of Music and Fine Arts of Philippine Women's University, PWU, who gave her vocal lessons and a chance to get a PW scholarship. She later sang 3 songs at a performance with her cousin Loreto at Holy Ghost College, now named College of the Holy Spirit, Manila. Imelda also joined the 1953 Miss Manila beauty pageant. The results became controversial, resulting in both Imelda and Miss Norma Jimenez being declared Manila's candidate to the larger Miss Philippines pageant. Both eventually lost to Miss Christina Galling. Courtship and marriage. Imelda and Ferdinand Marcos met on April 6, 1954, during a budget hearing at the Philippine Congress. Ferdinand was part of the opposition team who led the argument against the budget, while Imelda was there to visit her cousin Daniel, the Speaker of the House. During a recess, Imelda caught Ferdinand's eye, and he asked his journalist friend Jose Guevara of the Manila Times to introduce him to Imelda. At that time, Ferdinand already knew of Imelda, while Imelda knew very little of Ferdinand Marcos. After comparing heights and confirming that he was at least an inch taller than her, Ferdinand sought Guevara's help to pursue Imelda in marriage. This whirlwind courtship lasted only 11 days. During Holy Week of that year, Ferdinand visited Imelda's house, and when Imelda claimed that she planned to spend holidays in Baguio, Ferdinand and Guevara offered her a ride up to Daniel's family mansion where she planned to stay, while they booked a room in nearby Pines. For the remainder of that Holy Week, Ferdinand showered Imelda with flowers and gifts and visited her daily, prodding her to sign the marriage license that sealed the agreement. On April 16, 1954, Good Friday, after having been jokingly asked by Guevara if she wanted to be the first lady of the land someday, Imelda finally agreed to sign it. On April 17, 1954, Ferdinand and Imelda were secretly married by a reluctant Francisco Chanco, a judge befriended by Ferdinand who lived in the area. The church wedding followed only after receiving the blessing of Vicente Orestes, Imelda's father, which Ferdinand asked via telegram on Easter Sunday. Their wedding was held on May 1, 1954, at the San Miguel Pro Cathedral in Manila, where Imelda was christened. The marriage meant that Ferdinand's common-law wife, Carmen Ortega of La Union's Ortega political clan, with whom he had already sired 3 children, had to be quietly taken out of the public eye. 1965 presidential campaign. It was during the 1965 campaign that Imelda became influential as a political figure at the national level, supporting her husband's political tactics through her charismatic appeal and youth. Crowds of working-class Filipinos came out in droves to Marcos campaigns because they wanted to see the beautiful wife of Marcos. Campaign strategists incorporated Imelda's public appeal into the overall tone of the Marcos-led Nacionalista campaign, asking her to always appear at her best in public regardless of the type of audience, and encouraging her to wear her signature turnos as an integral part of their image strategy. Marcos heavily relied on Imelda, eventually telling the press at one point that it was Imelda who had delivered the 1 million vote margin he needed to win the election. It was in this period that Imelda described herself, a neophyte transitioning into a true political partner to her husband, as a butterfly breaking out of its cocoon. This led one foreign journalist to call her the Iron Butterfly. Imelda had assumed a managerial position in her husband's campaign early on when Marcos faced his first challenge, which was to win the presidential candidacy for the Nacionalista Party. She enthusiastically ran a detailed campaign, befriending the 1,347 delegates of the Nacionalista Party convention until Ferdinand Marcos won the party's presidential nomination on November 21st, 1964. McCoy recounts that it was supposedly also Imelda who convinced Fernando Lopez to accept the vice presidential nomination alongside Marcos. She met Lopez personally, appealing to him by recounting the many struggles she and Ferdinand faced during the campaign. Lopez refused several times until Imelda cried in front of him. When he relented, Imelda handed him a document to sign, stating that he had accepted the nomination as the Nacionalista vice presidential candidate. During the presidential election itself, she delivered votes from the southern province of Leyte and Manila. She was especially popular with the poor. Imelda also used her voice to appeal to voters, singing during campaigns. Her songs were usually varieties of local folk songs. First term, 1965 to 1969. During Ferdinand Marcos' first term, Imelda began doing the duties traditionally expected of a first lady, mostly social events and public appearances. Imelda became a power broker. Receptions at her offices in the Malacanang Music Room were sought after by cabinet members, heads of financing institutions, and business leaders who felt that she had Ferdinand's ear. In March 1966, Marcos established the Cultural Center of the Philippines through Executive Order No. 60 and arranged for Imelda to be elected chairman of the board in a bid to change the perception that she was just another politician's wife. Inauguration Ferdinand Marcos was elected as the 10th president of the Philippines on November 9, 1965. When he was inaugurated on December 30, 1965, Imelda officially became the First Lady. The Romualdez clan had been torn apart by the presidential campaign. To fix this, Imelda allegedly sent out invitations to family members, some of whom supported the opposing party, and told them they were all welcome at their house on Ortega Street in San Juan, which was then part of Rizal. Ferdinand and Imelda held mass in the courtyard of their house on Ortega Street before proceeding to Luneta Park for the inauguration ceremonies. At night, a state dinner hosted 60 guests in the reception hall of the Malacanang Palace. Early projects in the first 3 years as First Lady. She spent 1 million Cuban pesos for the beautification of Paco Park and 24 million Cuban pesos for the beautification of Fort Santiago. In May 1966, Imelda pushed a 12 million peso plan that pooled together the social welfare efforts of several dozen groups. The plan involved the construction of welfare villages and the reorientation of personnel to staff them. The cornerstone for First Village, the reception and study center in Quezon City, was laid in 1966, and several more were built from then until 1968. Marilla Hills in Alabang, the Children's Orphanage in Pasay, the Malawi Village in Tanay Rizal, a home for the aged in Quezon City, and the Philippine Village at Manila International Airport. In mid-1967, Imelda started the Share for Progress Seed Dispersal Program, a project that suggested making vegetable gardens out of idle lots all over the country. By 1968, 309,392 kits containing seeds had been distributed in over 1,500 towns. Blue Ladies of Blue Ladies, a group initially composed of wives of political men in the Nacionalista Party, played a critical role during Marcos' 1965 campaign. They contributed funds and provided publicity, giving the campaign a personal touch by visiting factories and farms to shake hands and converse with voters, making door-to-door appeals in slum areas. That year, they also introduced the purchase of radio and television time to campaign for Marcos through short speeches for voters. This was affordable because the Blue Ladies were mostly prominent matrons or young women married to men of means. Upon becoming First Lady, Imelda often asked members of the Blue Ladies to accompany her on trips abroad. One of her most famous socialite friends was Christina Ford. Imelda's Blue Lady, specifically Maria Luisa, a daughter of the rich Madrigal family, and the wife of Daniel Vasquez, contributed to her fashion spending. In 1968, Maria Luisa accompanied Imelda on an overseas trip, during which Imelda and her daughter Me spent $3.3 million. At that time, Vasquez and Maria Luisa opened a Citibank account. In November 1968, the couple added Fernanda Vasquez as a joint holder of the bank account, an allegation that Imelda and Fernanda Vasquez are one and the same is validated by the notations in the bank account in Imelda Marcos' handwriting. Beatles incident on July 4th, 1966. The First Lady invited the Beatles to perform at a private event in the palace, but the invitation was declined. As a result, an order to lock down Manila International Airport was enacted. This resulted in mobs trying to storm the band's hotel rooms and prevent them from leaving the country. There were also reports that a 100,000 Cuban pesos tax assessment was issued to their manager. Increased independence, the Dovey Beam scandal, which began as rumors in the late 1960s, eventually led to a significant change in Imelda's public role. President Marcos had met the American actress after she arrived in Manila in 1968 to play the female lead in Maharlika, a propaganda film portraying Ferdinand's supposed exploits during World War II. According to Beams, the two had an affair and she was moved into one of Ferdinand's safe houses, where she recorded their sexual encounters with his full consent. These tapes were later played at a press conference, causing great humiliation for Imelda. Members of the Marcos cabinet, such as Cesar Verrada and Gerardo Sickett, recount that Imelda used the humiliation of the W. Beams affair as leverage to begin developing an independent political agenda that gave her increasing power. Initially, this meant that Imelda had free rein on her projects while her husband prepared for the 1969 presidential campaign. But as Marcos' health declined, it involved her being put in increasingly powerful positions, including those of Minister of Human Settlements and Governor of Metro Manila. Second term 1969 to 1972. In July 1974, the annual Miss Universe pageant was held in Manila, to which then First Lady Imelda Marcos allegedly spent 40 million Cuban pesos, $5.5 million US, for the renovation of all public and private infrastructures throughout Manila and other cities where the pageant participants were subsequently toured. Foreign relations rose when the Marcoses went to the United States in September 1966. President Lyndon B. Johnson offered Imelda the Philippine war damage claims totaling $28 million US. Johnson agreed to allocate $3.5 million US for the Cultural Center, one of Imelda's projects. For the inauguration of the Cultural Center of the Philippines, a gala opening of the Golden Salakot, a pageant drama depicting a story about the prehistory of the Philippines, was held on September 8, 1969. U.S. President Richard Nixon was invited, but instead California Governor and future President Ronald Reagan, along with his wife, flew to the country on Air Force One for the event. Accounts indicate that the First Lady attempted to bring other celebrities by securing tickets for them on Air Force One, but she was denied by President Nixon. Some accounts have also mentioned that this trip by Governor Reagan and his wife led to a closeness between the Reagans and the Marcoses. In 1971, Imelda attended Iran's 500-year celebration of the founding of the Persian Empire. According to Palace insiders, this trip provided her with a social introduction to some of the world's wealthiest people. Accusation of bribery in Constitutional Convention on May 19, 1972, the Constitutional Convention delegate for Ladies' First District, Eduardo Quintero, accused Imelda and 13 others of bribing some of the convention members to vote against provisions that would have prevented Marcos from retaining power beyond the 2 four-year terms allowed by the previous constitution. In the stress following the accusations and media circus, Imelda claimed to have suffered a miscarriage. Later, this was revealed to be a hoax to avoid Quintero's charges. This was seen as an example of the lengths to which Imelda would go to support Ferdinand and her ambition. Actions preceding martial law in Ferdinand's diary preceding May, he wrote that he and Imelda were planning to wager all their power and wealth on a single throw of the dice of fate for the sake of the people and the Republic. On the eve of September 5, 1972, Tourism Minister Manuel Elizalde called each member of Manila's Foreign Press Corps to a party. Imelda arrived at the party, allegedly rambling about democracy and how only the Americans could afford it. On that same day, martial law was announced. Ferdinand stated that the purpose of martial law was to create a new society with reformed institutions, free of inequalities, corruption, or crime. Imelda called it martial law with a smile. Days later, a warrant of arrest was issued for Amelita Cruz, author of the You-Know-Who columns on Imelda, with orders that had come directly from the Palace study. Martial law 1972 to 1981. During this period, Imelda orchestrated public events using national funds to bolster her and her husband's image. She secured the Miss Universe 1974 pageant in Manila, which required the construction of the Folk Arts Theater in less than 3 months. She organized the Kasaysayaning Lahi, a festival showcasing Philippine history. She also initiated social programs, such as the Green Revolution, intended to address hunger by encouraging household vegetable gardens, and create a national family planning program. In 1972, she took control of the distribution of a bread ration called Nutribon, which was actually provided by the United States Agency for International Development. Stabbing, attack, and assassination attempt against Imelda Marcos occurred on December 7, 1972, when an assailant named Carlito Dimahilig tried to stab her on live television with a BOLO knife during a broadcast at Neon Filipino, but was shot by the police. Congressman Jose Asperas and Linda Amor Robles were also injured while trying to subdue the attacker. The motive appeared related to her role in her husband's presidency, though some dissidents believed it was staged by the government. Ferdinand Marcos was immediately flown by helicopter to Makati Medical Center, while Imelda's husband rushed to the hospital upon hearing the news while playing golf. Foreign relations roles in 1972, Imelda Marcos initiated her first trip to the Soviet Union, dubbed a cultural mission, which eventually led to the establishment of diplomatic relations between the Soviet Union and the Philippines. In 1975, after the assassination of King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, Marcos sought to extend official condolences. Although women were not welcome in the Saudi court, Imelda, through a connection with the surgeon who had performed heart surgery on the new king, managed to become the first female guest to be honored. In 1978, she was appointed as ambassador plenipotentiary and extraordinary, allowing her to tour the United States, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and Cuba. During her travels, she became friends with Richard Nixon, Muammar Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, Fidel Castro, and Joseph Broz Tito. She also traveled to Iraq to secure oil and to Libya for a peace treaty with the Moro National Liberation Front. Governor of Metro Manila in 1975, Ferdinand Marcos issued Presidential Decree No. 824, establishing the Metro Manila Commission MMC as the central government for Metro Manila, and named Imelda to head it, making her governor of Metro Manila until the Marcoses were deposed in 1986. Minister of Human Settlements in 1976, Ferdinand Marcos appointed Imelda as Minister of Human Settlements, a post she held until the EDSA revolution in February 1986. This position enabled her to construct the Cultural Center of the Philippines, the Philippine Heart Center, the Lung Center of the Philippines, the Philippine International Convention Center, the Coconut Palace, the Manila Film Center, and the Calwit Safari Park. Batasang Pambansa in 1978. The Kilusang Bagong Lipunan Party fielded Imelda as a candidate in the Philippine parliamentary elections. Because most opposition candidates were either in jail or had limited mobility due to martial law, Imelda Marcos easily won a seat as a member of the interim Batasang Pambansa representing Region 4, Metro Manila. Role in Benigno Aquino Jr.'s exile in 1980. After learning that former Senator Benigno Aquino Jr. had a life-threatening heart ailment, Imelda convinced Ferdinand Marcos to allow Aquino to leave for the United States for medical treatment. This was arranged after a secret hospital visit by Imelda. Aquino supposedly agreed to her conditions that he would return to the Philippines and not speak out against the Marcos regime in the U.S. After making a quick recovery, Aquino decided to remain in the U.S., remarking that a pact with the devil is no pact at all. 6 months after martial law was lifted on January 17, 1981, Ferdinand Marcos was re-elected as president. While her husband began to suffer from lupus erythematosus, Imelda effectively ruled in his place. Imelda claimed that during her last meeting with Aquino on May 21, 1983, in New York, she begged him for 3.5 hours to postpone his return to the Philippines until it was safe for him to come. Aquino returned to the Philippines on August 21, 1983, and was assassinated at Manila International Airport upon his arrival. Feeling that he was pressured into causing an investigation into the assassination, Ferdinand created the Agrava Commission, a fact-finding committee that ultimately found the military guilty. Downfall on February 7, 1986. Snap elections were held between Ferdinand Marcos and Corazon Aquino, the widow of Benigno Aquino Jr. despite Ferdinand Marcos claiming to have won. Allegations of vote rigging led to mass protests, later known as the People Power Revolution. On February 25th, Ferdinand Marcos, with Imelda by his side, held the inauguration at Malacanang Palace. Later that day, Ferdinand Marcos agreed to step down and was given safe passage for him and his family to flee to Hawaii. Exile in Hawaii, 1986 to 1991. At midnight on February 26, 1986, the Marcos family fled to Hawaii with a party of about 80 individuals, including extended family and close associates. Their arrival was controversial and led to calls from Hawaii residents for the government to force the Marcoses to leave. The U.S. government initially hosted the exiles at Hickam Air Force Base. Ferdinand and Imelda later moved into residences in Makiki Heights, Honolulu. Ferdinand Marcos eventually died in exile in September 1989. His son Bongbong was the only family member present at his deathbed. After leaving Malacanang Palace, press reports around the world noted Imelda's lavish wardrobe, which was said to include 15 mink coats, 508 gowns, 888 handbags, and 3,000 pairs of shoes. Some reports estimated up to 7,500 pairs, but Time magazine later reported the final tally as 1,060. The U.S. government documented that the Marcos family entered the country with millions of dollars in cash, stocks, jewelry, and gold kilo bars inscribed "To my husband on our 24th anniversary." Returned from exile, 1991, present. On November 4th, 1991, President Corazon Aquino allowed Imelda and her children to return to the Philippines to be formally charged in tax fraud and corruption cases as part of efforts to retrieve funds from the Marcoses' Swiss bank accounts. After returning from exile, Imelda re-entered politics. In 1992, she ran for president in the 1992 Philippine presidential election, finishing 5th out of 7 candidates. She was elected as a congresswoman of Leyte in the 1995 elections, representing the 1st District, despite a disqualification lawsuit which the Supreme Court ruled in her favor. She chose not to seek re-election in Congress and instead sought the presidency again in the 1998 election, but later withdrew to support eventual winner Joseph Estrada, finishing 9th among 11 candidates. She considered running for mayor of Manila in 2001, but did not follow through. In November 2006, Marcos started her own business, a fashion label, Imelda Collection, including jewelry, clothing, and shoes with help from her daughter and me. Imelda ran for the 2nd District of Ilocos Norte in the 2010 Philippine House of Representatives elections to replace her son, Ferdinand Jr. Bongbong, who ran for senator under the Nacionalista Party. During her term, she chaired the Millennium Development Goals Committee in the lower house. She was re-elected on May 14, 2013, and on May 9, 2016, for a third and final term. In October 2018, Marcos filed her certificate of candidacy to run for governor of Ilocos Norte in the 2019 general election to replace her daughter and me, who was term limited and chose to run for senator. However, following her conviction of graft, she withdrew from the race a month later and was substituted by her grandson Matthew Manitoc, who eventually won the governorship. Marcos underwent a successful angioplasty at St. Luke's Medical Center, Global City, Tagwig on May 7, 2023. She was hospitalized in March 2024 after contracting a suspected case of pneumonia. Major court cases Imelda Marcos has been involved in numerous court cases in the Philippines and abroad. Some are criminal cases concerning corruption charges, while others are civil or forfeiture cases regarding her bank accounts. 1988 racketeering case, Manhattan. In October 1988, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, along with 8 associates, including Saudi businessman and weapons smuggler Adnan Khashoggi, were indicted by a federal grand jury in Manhattan on charges of racketeering, conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Imelda pleaded not guilty to charges that she used $103 million in stolen government funds to purchase Manhattan real estate and art. Tobacco heiress Doris Duke posted $5 million bail for her. The Marcoses' defense team was led by attorney Jerry Spence. Actor George Hamilton testified under immunity, acknowledging that he had received a $5.5 million loan from one of Marcos' associates. In July 1990, following a 3-month trial, Imelda was acquitted of all charges after she successfully characterized herself as a poor widow who knew nothing about her husband's activities. 1990, Swiss Federal Supreme Court forfeiture case in 1990. The Swiss Federal Supreme Court ruled that funds in the Marcoses' Swiss bank accounts were of criminal provenance. This decision paved the way for transferring assets worth around $356 million back to Philippines. These assets had been frozen by Swiss courts in 1986 after the People Power Revolution. The ruling eventually led to reforms in 1998 that made it more difficult for dictators to keep money in the Swiss banking system. 1995 Human Rights Violations Class Suit Hawaii. In February 1995, the U.S. District Court for the District of Hawaii ruled against the Marcoses, awarding $1.96 billion to 9,539 victims of human rights violations during the Marcos dictatorship. This decision was upheld by the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in 1996, though enforcement in the Philippines has been hindered by jurisdiction issues. Corruption cases in the Philippines after the Marcos family's return in the early 1990s. 28 criminal cases were filed against Imelda by the Philippine Office of the Ombudsman from 1991 to 1995, including graft and malversation of public funds. In 1993, she was convicted on a graft case, but this conviction was overturned by the appellate court in 2008 and upheld by the Philippine Supreme Court in 2018 due to technical issues with evidence. In March 2008, a judge in Manila acquitted her of 32 counts of illegal transfers of funds to Swiss bank accounts between 1968 and 1976, ruling that the government had failed to prove its case. In 2011, the Sendigambian ordered her to return $280,000 US in government funds taken from the National Food Authority. On November 9, 2018, the Sendigambian convicted her on 7 counts of graft and corruption, disqualifying her from public office. While the sanction is pending appeal, she withdrew her candidacy for governor of Ilocos Norte. On November 12, 2018, her attorney filed a motion for post-conviction remedies, including bail. The court granted bail due to her ill health, and she posted bail on November 16, 2018. She intends to appeal her conviction, first by motion for reconsideration to the Sandigambian, and then via direct appeal to the Philippine Supreme Court, which was eventually granted. Personal wealth, the Philippine Supreme Court deems the unexplained wealth of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos to be ill-gotten under Republic Act 1379 of 1955. This law presumes that property acquired by a public officer that is manifestly out of proportion to their salary and lawful income was unlawfully acquired. A 2012 decision treated most of the Marcos' assets, including the Marcos jewels, as unlawful, noting that Ferdinand Marcos' salaries range from 60,000 Cuban pesos a year, 1966 to 1976, to 100,000 Cuban pesos a year, 1977 to 1985, and that Imelda Marcos earned 75,000 Cuban pesos a year as Minister of Human Settlements from June 1976 to February 1986, about $304,372.43. Estimates of their ill-gotten wealth vary, with figures around $5 billion to $10 billion for wealth acquired in the last years of the Marcos administration, while some believe it could be as much as $30 billion. The Daily Telegraph estimates Imelda's current net worth at a more modest $22 million, the amount she declared in 2012, but suggests that the Marcoses stole billions of pesos during their rule, an amount that could pay off the entire Philippine foreign debt. A 1985 report to U.S. Congress estimated that the Marcoses had stolen $10 billion in recent years, with some sources suggesting the figure was closer to $13 billion. Jovito Salonga, the first chairperson of the Philippine Commission on Good Government, PEG, later estimated their wealth to be $5 billion to $10 billion. Internationally, this estimate is the one most commonly cited. Aside from their amassed wealth, Imelda Marcos was famous for her extravagant spending, becoming a byword for conspicuous consumption. On one occasion, she spent $2,000 on chewing gum at San Francisco International Airport and once forced a plane to perform a U-turn midair because she had forgotten to buy cheese in Rome. Portions of her renowned shoe collection are now housed in the National Museum of the Philippines and a shoe museum in Marikina. Typhoon Haiyan Yolanda damaged her ancestral home in Tacloban, which also serves as a museum, though she retains homes in Ilocos Norte and Makati. Sequestration of some of the Marcos' wealth has been recovered through court cases, either returned to the Philippine government or awarded as reparations to human rights victims. Additional recovery has occurred through settlements and compromise deals with Imelda or her cronies. However, some cases have been dismissed due to technical issues, and an unidentified portion of their wealth remains unrecovered. In March 1968, Ferdinand and Imelda opened 4 accounts with Credit Suisse in Zurich under the aliases William Saunders and Jane Ryan. These were later transferred into accounts under various dummy foundations, but when discovered after the 1986 revolution, the Swiss Federal Council froze them. On December 21, 1990, the Swiss Federal Supreme Court ruled these accounts could be turned over to the Philippine government, pending a final Philippine court judgment. In 1997, the Swiss Federal Supreme Court declared the funds of criminal provenance and permitted their transfer to an escrow account in Manila, with the confiscation ruling finally issued by the Philippine Supreme Court on July 15, 2003. Switzerland ultimately released a total of $683 million in Marcos funds to the Philippine Treasury in 2004. Throughout the 1980s, Imelda Marcos bought 4 prominent buildings in Manhattan. The Crown Building at the corner of 57th and 5th, $51 million. 40 Wall Street, later renamed the Trump Building, the Herald Center, $60 million, and the building at 200 Madison Avenue. She declined to buy the Empire State Building, deeming it too ostentatious. On January 13, 2014, 3 collections of Imelda Marcos' jewelry, the Malacanang, Remedios, and Hawaii collections, along with paintings by Claude Monet, were seized by the Philippine government. In 2015, a rare pink diamond worth $5 million was discovered in her collection. The 3 jewelry collections were appraised at about $21 million on February 16, 2016, when the government announced plans to auction them off, though they had not been sold as of April 17, 2020. Her property once included a 175-piece art collection with works by Michelangelo, Botticelli, Canaletto, Raphael, as well as Monet's L'Église est la Sainte Vétule, 1881, Alfred Sisley's Langland Bay, 1887, and Albert Marquet's Le Surprise de Jeanne CD said 1946. On October 17, 2013, an attempted sale of two Claude Monet paintings, L'Église de Véthule and Le Bassin aux Nymphes, became the subject of a legal case in New York against Vilma Bautista, a former aide to Imelda Marcos. Bautista was sentenced in 2014 to 2 to 6 years in prison for attempting to sell valuable masterpieces that belonged to her country. In all, about 170 billion Cuban pesos worth of Marcos wealth had been recovered by the PSC by 2018, roughly $3.6 billion out of their estimated $5 billion to $10 billion in ill-gotten wealth. Net worth in 2012 and 2012, Imelda Marcos declared her net worth to be $22 million and was listed as the second richest Filipino politician behind Manny Pacquiao. She has claimed without evidence that her fortune came from Ferdinand Marcos' discovery of Yamashita's gold, a semi-mythical treasure believed to be part of the Japanese loot from World War II. Marcos has also stated in interviews, "If you know how rich you are not rich. But me, I am not aware of the extent of my wealth. That's how rich we are." World record for largest theft from a government, the amount the Marcoses were estimated to have plundered from the Philippines is so vast that it has set world records. Imelda Marcos and her husband Ferdinand were jointly credited in 1989 by Guinness World Records with the largest ever theft from a government, estimated at $5 billion to $10 billion. She is quoted as having stated, "We practically own everything in the Philippines, from electricity, telecommunications, airlines, banking, beer and tobacco, newspaper publishing, television stations, shipping, oil and mining, hotels and beach resorts, down to coconut milling, small farms, real estate and insurance." In 2009, Newsweek listed Imelda Marcos as one of the greediest people of all time. Marcos responded, "I plead guilty. For me, greedy is giving. I was First Lady for 20 years. You have to be greedy first to give to all. It is natural. The only things we keep in life are those we give away." Edifice complex, the term edifice complex, has been applied to Imelda's penchant for grandiose public buildings, often constructed in impossibly short order. Her building projects were frequently in the brutalist style, characterized by massive, fortress-like structures designed to evoke a sense of grandeur. In 1966, Ferdinand Marcos issued Executive Order No. 60, establishing the Cultural Center of the Philippines and appointing its board of directors. The board elected Imelda as chairperson, giving her the legal mandate to negotiate and manage funds for the center. The Cultural Center of the Philippines, CCP, complex is considered the premier symbol of Imelda's edifice complex. Designed by architect Leandro Locsin, it was built on reclaimed land along Roxas Boulevard in Manila, covering an area of about 21 hectares, 52 acres. 90,000 pesos was granted by the Philippine American Culture Foundation for its construction, aided by funds from the Cultural Development Fund and the Special Fund for Education. Upon completion, its cost escalated to 50 Cuban pesos million, a 50,000% increase over the original budget. Although construction material prices increased by 30 to 40% during that time, the substantial escalation in expenditures remains highly questionable. Imelda called the CCP complex the sanctuary of the Filipino soul, as it became the center of all state-initiated cultural productions. Another construction project linked to Imelda during Ferdinand's first term is the San Juanico Bridge, which connects the island of Samar to Leyte, Imelda's home province. Although not initiated by her, it was promoted by the administration as Ferdinand Marcos' gift to his wife. It was funded with foreign loans of $22 million, about 140 million Cuban pesos, from Japan's Overseas Technical Cooperation Agency, OTCA, the predecessor to today's Japan International Cooperation Agency, JITA. Upon its completion on July 2, 1973, Imelda's birthday, economists and public works engineers quickly labeled it a white elephant because its average daily traffic was too low to justify its cost. Cultural influence of Imelda Marcos features prominently in protest art displayed in the lobby of the Banteag ng MGA Bayani Museum, which documents the events of the Marcos dictatorship and honors the heroes and martyrs who fought the regime. Immeldific in the late 1980s. The revelation that Imelda Marcos had amassed a huge collection of art, jewelry, property, and most famously at least 1,000 pairs of shoes turned her into a household name, frequently compared to Marie Antoinette of France, except with shoes. This led to the coining of the Philippine English adjective immeldific to describe anything exaggeratedly ostentatious or in poor taste, especially in clothing, architecture, or decor. It also describes a lifestyle marked by extravagant excess. The term has also entered international English, with writers noting that it simply means to be like Imelda. Fashion Marcos influenced fashion in the Philippines, although her role as a patron of the arts and fashion remains controversial. She actively promoted the terno, which became her sartorial symbol, through projects like Bagong Enyo and exhibitions abroad, such as the Philippine contribution to Expo 75 in Okinawa, Japan. Imelda made a conscious effort to portray herself as a patron of the arts, supporting Filipino haute couture designers such as Pito y Moreno and Ino Sato. In a section of the 2003 film Ramona Diaz, Imelda explained that she maintained her extravagant clothing because it inspired the poor to dress better. Portrayals in News and Art in August 2019, director Lauren Greenfield debuted her documentary film The Kingmaker, which features the political career of Imelda Marcos and focuses on the Marcos family's efforts to rehabilitate their image and return to power, including plans to see her son Bongbong become vice president. The film has received critical acclaim. In the late 1990s, Imelda Marcos was the subject of a PBS documentary titled Imelda, directed by Ramona S. Diaz. Released in 2003, it documented her marriage to Ferdinand Marcos, her role during his dictatorship, her exile in Hawaii, and her eventual return to the Philippines. The film premiered at the International Documentary Film Festival Amsterdam and was featured at Sundance, where it won an award for excellence in cinematography. The villain character Madam in the popular Filipino comic book series Trees is visually based on Marcos, with coif hair, butterfly sleeves, and deep connections to powerful figures in the series. The second track of Mark Knopfler's 1996 album Golden Heart is a sardonic song about her. In 2010, British producer Fatboy Slim and musician David Byrne released a concept album about her life titled Here Lies Love, which later became a rock musical of the same name. In Manila, performance artist Carlos Seldrin became known for his Living La Vida Imelda walking tour. Filipino-American drag artist Manila Luzon impersonated Imelda on the Snatch Game challenge in the third season of RuPaul's Drag Race, humorously referencing her famous obsession with shoes. Hawaiian comedian Frank De Lima has also impersonated her. On an episode of Saturday Night Live aired on October 8, 1988, comedian Nora Dunn portrayed her during Weekend Update. She has been portrayed in film by Clavel Bandana in Chavit, by Dimples Romana Marcos in Malala Mokaya, by Rufa Gutierrez and Maid in Malacanang in its sequel Martyr or Murderer, and by Cindy Miranda as young Imelda in Martyr or Murderer. She is also referenced in Netflix shows such as Russian Doll, The Crown, and Dynasty. An original musical, Here Lies Love, by David Byrne and Fatboy Slim, chronicles her life from childhood to exile and employs disco and club music along with immersive staging. The title refers to a phrase Imelda once mentioned she wanted on her tombstone. Originally conceived as a song cycle, it was presented in concert formats and later transferred to off-Broadway and eventually on Broadway in 2023.